South Asia Committee of the International Law Section presents the Global Lawyers Summit in association with CNBC TV 18.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. Why don't I start with just introducing my panelists here. Shweta here is the global CFO at the Hydraulics and Water Treatment Solutions at Wipro Enterprises Limited. Prior to this, she has held various finance and leadership roles at Honeywell and GE. Thank you, Shweta.
Thank you. Pleasure as
for joining us. Mr. Raman Murthy. He's a 1991 batch of Indian Defence Accounts Services and is currently serving as the Principal Integrated Financial Advisor, Air Force, under Ministry of Defence. He served as the Joint Secretary for the Ministry of Corporate Affairs previously, and if I may say so, one of the most dynamic. Thank you, Mr. Murthy, for joining us today. Sanjeev perhaps needs no introduction in addition to saying outrageous things. He is the founder and executive vice chairperson of InfoEdge, which owns Naukri.com. He is a serial investor, if I may say that, and is also a co-founder of Ashoka University. He was honored with the Padma Shri in January 2020. Thank you so much, Sanjeev, for joining us. Rajan, he's the managing director at Peak 15 Partner, a prolific angel investor who has backed and served various successful startups even at very early stages. Earlier, he was head of Google India and Southeast Asia. Thank you so much for being here with us. I think my panelists have been asking a lot of questions about this conference and so many lawyers, and there has been that slight apprehension, right?
No, it's a new experience that, lawyers will listen to us.
I myself am from AZB and Partners. I am a multi-specialist lawyer. Just a fancy word for saying that, I do various things. I work extensively in corporate M&A, white collar, regulatory investigations, and financial reporting and corporate governance. So let me just, with no further ado, start with our panel discussion today. So I'll start with a few statistics. The wealth concentrated in the richest 1% of India's population is at its highest now in 6 decades. These are all based on various reports, and I'm sure there'll be contrary data depending on who's writing the report. By the end of 2023, India's richest citizens owned 40.1% of the country's wealth. The 10,000 wealthiest individuals of the 920 million Indian adults own an average of 22.6 billion in wealth, which is over 16,000 times the country's average, while the top 1% possess an average of 54 million in wealth. It is quite obvious that these types of income disparities have their own socio-economic issues, but that's of course one aspect. But our focus here, which is in theme with the conference, is really on corporate governance. And what does concentrated ownership do to the quality of corporate governance of an entity? So, in other words, say a promoter-owned company, how is the quality of corporate governance in that versus a dispersed shareholding company? Or say an MNC. I mean, a lot of people automatically assume multinational company, meaning they spend a lot of time and resource in governance and internal controls, versus say a non-MNC company where which is say promoter owned, and really the only focus is profitability, and therefore whether the costs come in the way of doing something more on the corporate governance fronts. So I'm not saying these as factual statements. I'm just putting it out there as a theme for us to explore in this in this session. And when I talk about corporate governance, first, of course, in this era where we have ESG, sustainability, all of these are really the key mantras. So even what corporate governance meant a few years back has now changed. So we are really going to talk about this new era of corporate governance, and where things it's now moved beyond shareholder focus. Earlier, corporate governance regimes were more focused on shareholder interest. Now, corporate governance regimes are focusing more on stakeholder interest. So, everything that you do for community matters, your CSR matters, what are you doing to protect the environment matters, what social obligations is the company undertaking also matters, quality of financial reporting, quality of the disclosures that companies are making, all of these issues matter. So my first question, which I'm going to ask all the panelists to really comment on, is do you think there is a negative relationship between ownership concentration and quality of corporate governance? Sanjeev, should we start with you?
Yeah, look, what I've always maintained is that corporate governance begins and ends in the founder's heads, right? Now, if the founder is fundamentally clean and honest, he or she will do their best. They do their best to make sure the company is well governed, they are well governed. And if there are lapses, it's probably not because they're intentional. It's, they made a mistake, they didn't know, right? Now, where a founder isn't straight, we have seen the best paraphernalia of corporate governance. He or she can find his way around, and we've seen it, auditors, independent directors, all kinds of processes. So really, corporate governance is about A, you being honest, and B, surrounding yourself with people and processes and systems and organizations who will give you enough opinion on what is the right thing to do and what is not the right thing to do, and then listening to that opinion, right? There are so many nuances in corporate governance which I, as a founder, took a few years to comprehend, but fortunately, A, I wanted to be honest, and B, I had boards, I had auditors who told us, yeah, ye galt hai. Take a simple concept of, let's say, conflict of interest or related party transaction, okay? Or convergence of interest, rather. So, we raised money from ICICI Venture in April 2000. We signed the SHA. The money was coming in tranches. First tranche came in. And next thing I know, they're in Delhi and say, "Yaar, kuch baat karni hai. We want to have a meeting." I said, "Sure." He says, "We need you to understand a few things and commit to them." I said, "Sure, what?" He says, "First thing, you must comprehend that it is no longer your company alone. You're running it, you're in charge of it, but it is also our company because we now are shareholders. And the company belongs to every shareholder, including your colleagues who have ESOP or whom you're going to talk to. So as the largest shareholder and the CEO, you have to be the custodian of everybody's interests and not just yours. So first understand that and think about it. So you look after your minority shareholders and their interests just as if they're your interests. Okay, first thing. Second thing, they said, we've given you money to grow the company. Understand two more things. You cannot get rich on our money, which basically means we decide your salary, and it won't be very high. It'll be survival plus a little bit more. Okay? Number three, you can't get rich till we get rich, which basically means grow the company, make every share valuable, and you can't sell a single share until we sell. Okay, so no secondaries. Okay, so there was 4 or 5 or 6 principles outlined, all of which reflected in some way or the other around 3 or 4 core themes of good governance. And as a good founder, if you've got to understand and internalize those. And if you do that, then they said independent director, yeah, we want a big five auditor, we want, all those things. We want an internal auditor. So there were 5-6 things we discussed early on, and all got done. And I think there was a very clear understanding on how this company would be governed. Now, it was, of course, easy for us because we wanted to do it anyway. So they didn't have to try too hard to persuade us, right, to follow all these principles. But really, it's about now, till the IPO, I personally owned 54% of the company. That's reasonably concentrated. Okay? We are still, I think, well governed. So it's about the founder, what he or she thinks, what kind of company they want to build, what kind of culture they want to create in the company, and what kind of role models they have as organizations, and what kind of reputation they want to build, and what kind of legacy they want to leave. So now, are there likely to be more checks and balances if somebody in a company where somebody owns 90%, where somebody else owns another company where you own 20%? Answer is yes. But it is still going to be about what's in the founder's head.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that perspective, Sanjeev. Rajan, let's hear your
Yeah,
views.
look, I completely agree with Sanjeev. Look, I think the short answer is concentrated ownership does not necessarily mean bad governance, if that's the question, right? Look, I'll start with a story. I was a McKinsey partner in Chicago in the 90s. The most celebrated company in the Americas in the 90s was a company called Enron. I wrote case studies about Jeff Skilling, who happened to be a McKinsey partner. And Jeff certainly wasn't a large owner of the company. He was a professional CEO who was brought down. And I think, those of you that have studied corporate frauds in America know that story, right? And then I moved to India in 2005. And the most celebrated CEO after Mr. Murthy and Mr. Premji was the Satyam CEO. He kept getting corporate governance award after award, right? Now, that's different. He was he did have, concentrated ownership. So I think look, at the end of the day, as Sanjeev said, my view is 99.9% of founders, of professional CEOs, of professional executives, of management teams want to do the right thing, right? I think at least in startup land, I think collectively we have to do a better job of making sure every founder understands what's right, what's wrong, how do you get it done, etc. But also I think what we've learned is that 0.01% that is, what I call evil, right, or unethical, it's almost impossible to catch them. You have the best auditors, you audit them 3 times over, you have boards, and you still find out that, so I think it's unfortunately it is human behavior, and we just have to get better. This is the ultimate objective of AI. The ultimate objective. I want to look at you, and I want to detect whether you're evil. That's the ultimate vision model that we're going to build. But anyway, so to your question, I don't think this is necessarily it. Now it's really about, as Sanjeev said, in the world that we live in, the two of us, which is startup land. It really is about founders and also investors need to make sure that founders understand, what it means to have good governance, put in place the systems in place, right? I mean, it's interesting that 2 concentrated companies with concentrated ownership, InfoEdge and Wipro, are among the 2 best governed companies in India, right? And arguably across the world. Infosys, I mean, they set the standards on corporate governance. That was a promoter, of a star company that was founded by 3 or 4 founders. So a long answer to your question, but that's sort of where I come out.
Thank you so much. I hope you don't use this AI tool on lawyers.
See, that's also an interesting idea. Maybe no, we'll give it to lawyers on both sides.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting point that you made that, and you also brought in this perspective about the other stakeholders who play an important role in the overall corporate governance ecosystem. So you mentioned auditors, and then there are independent directors. And, with that, I'm going to ask Mr. Murthy actually, as a regulator, how has the regulator really perceived this? Because one of the trends that we've seen, in frauds and all, while of course uh, there is this whole mechanism that goes after the promoter, but somehow the speed at which the other stakeholders are pursued, such as the auditors or the independent directors also, uh, there seems to that seems to proceed actually quite rapidly as well. So there's more focus on some of the stakeholders, whereas yes, promoters are definitely part of that, but where is that balance, and what is the regulatory perspective around this?
So, thank you so much for having me here. As a first step, I would like to say that whatever I say here is in my personal capacity and should not be ascribed to being the official view of the government of India in any manner whatsoever. So, whatever I say, I draw upon my long years in the Ministry of Corporate Affairs and hope to contribute some value to this discussion. Just as Vinati reeled off a few stats, I've got a few stats of my own, which I'll share with you. Most of you may be familiar with these. So there are a little over 60,000 listed companies in the entire world, which have a market cap of approximately $115 trillion or so. Large institutional investors typically account for more than 40% of the global market cap alone. 15% of the global market cap is held by the public sector. And in almost half the world's publicly listed companies, the top 3 shareholders together hold more than 50%. And if you take more than 30% shareholding by the top 3 shareholders, then almost 75% of the globally listed companies, the stock is held by the top 3 shareholders. So when we talk about concentration as a regulator, we are not just looking at individual promoters as in human beings alone, but we are also concerned about the institutional part of it, as also the corporate ownership of companies, So that is a very significant amount as well. But at the final tally, it is the human being who's behind any entity. And as my friends Rajan and Sanjeev brought out, I couldn't have agreed with them more, that if the human being behind the face of the ownership, if his brains are convoluted, and if his basic fundamental values are somehow not on an even keel, then no amount of regulatory checks and balances, no amount of scrutiny by auditors or by independent directors can help matters. Insofar as the regulator is concerned, typically the view that is taken is that the regulator is like a stern grandfather who holds a big stick and who shows the stick, which is only to be used on an occasion when there is absolute failure of a nature which needs to be punished. So I don't think there is a clear correlation. I don't know just how many studies have been undertaken in the corporate sector worldwide. And I don't have data in the Indian context, especially of the failure of corporate governance in individual companies. But all I would say is that I don't think the relationship is linear. And there is more to failure of corporate governance than just concentrated ownership. And we've had recent instances wherein some of the marquee names failed to pass the test of probity, I would say. And the impact is going to be felt by all the stakeholders. I will also say that as a regulator, our thoughts are always, it is not just these direct stakeholders who are affected by the failure of a corporate governance in a particular company, but as a tribe, everybody gets affected. So one failure, the regulator will probably start taking notice. Couple of failures, the regulator will, start sitting up and keeping a watch on it. But at some stage, when there is a repeat failure of a similar nature, there will follow a certain amount of framework changes which impact the rest of the ecosystem also. So that is something that everybody should be mindful of. And that is what actually should be breeding a sense of responsibility, when you govern your own company.
Thank you, Mr. Murthy. So, there is always this tension between the values of equality and efficiency. You want to do good, but you also want to ensure that the entity is efficient and profitable. And corporates are obviously not immune to this value tension. So even though ESG and all is clearly now the buzzword, I hope I'm not saying something too controversial, but the main focus is still on profitability, and there will always be resistance to changes that impact that profitability, even if it is in the short run. So Shweta, I'm going to ask this question to you first, Are entities where there is concentrated ownership and say where there is a dominant promoter shareholder, the first hypothesis that I want to test is, are they more successful in terms of efficiency and profitability?
Thanks, Vinity. So having worked with both US conglomerates, on the industrial side, as well as now with Wipro, which is primarily a promoter-driven company with concentrated shareholding, I think the difference that I've seen is definitely more agility, more efficiency in decision making with promoter-driven company. The promoters have a very, very clear vision of what the end goal is. Profitability, I would say, is obviously the key benchmark which all the companies should, aspire for. There is nothing wrong in it, right? But what also is that, how are those profits used? Like, for example, I'll just give an example of Wipro. Even though the ownership is concentrated with the promoters, both on Wipro Limited, which is a listed company, and the other group companies which are unlisted, majority of the profits are used for Wipro Foundation, which primarily help the larger community and the larger well-being in various areas that we have identified as a group, whether it's healthcare, education, upliftment of women, etc. Right? So it depends on what that motive is. Definitely more agility, more efficiency. We don't have to, jump hoops and hoops just for decision making, because all said and done, in the global scenario of conglomerates, which are say 10, $20 billion, India still is a small pie, or portion of the overall pie. So that say for India at the global stage, I think is what is still driving challenges in terms of decision making in conglomerates which are really, really large. But the promoter-driven company is definitely more agile, is in my experience that I've seen, having worked on both the sides.
Thank you, Shweta. Rajan, views from you on that?
Yeah, look, I think up to a certain stage, right? There's no question that like in startups, founder-driven companies are much more agile, much more innovative, because the founders are able to take a lot more risk. And then I would say, if in the situations where the founders scale, let's take Meta as an example in the US, and I'll pick one in India as well, right? Like, it's very difficult to see how a professional CEO would have taken the actions that Mark Zuckerberg has taken over the last 18 months, right? Because he can be bolder than any professional CEO who, by definition, has been brought in with a mandate, with a certain mandate. So I do think now very few founders scale to be able to run billion and then 10 and 100 billion and then $1 trillion type companies, right? So I would say in general it's true up to a certain stage, and then beyond the stage it really depends on the founder. And I think if you bring it back to India, India's two most valuable companies, one is a professionally managed company. I don't know whether there's a control ownership or not. That's the Tata Group. The other one is clearly promoter driven, which is Reliance, right? And therein lies two examples of I think extraordinary reinvention, innovation, ability to drive cash and so on and so forth. So I don't think, again, right, I don't think this notion of does this control, what's the word, large ownership, does it lead to sort of less innovation? Absolutely not. I think founders are just very, very good at doing that, right? Now then it's like everything else. Do they scale to become great CEOs? Do they scale to put in place the right governance, as Sanjeev was talking about? Can they take companies public? Can they build teams? And that's very individual specific. But at least in the technology industry, one thing we have learned is most companies, now that is changing because now Satya runs Microsoft, Sundar runs, I'm talking about globally, Sundar runs Google, Zuckerberg still runs, unfortunately, Steve Jobs is no longer, so Tim Cook runs Apple. So if you look at the top 7 companies in tech, 3 of them are founder driven, including NVIDIA with Jensen. The other 4 are professionally run, but it's taken a long time, right? I'd say first 25 years of tech, it was really all founders. In fact, like I work for Michael Dell. I mean, I've done Dell, Google, Microsoft. So I can tell you that there is a huge difference. If you have a founder who scales to be an extraordinary CEO, almost always that company wins versus a professional executive, only because they're just able to move faster. They're able to take more risk. And in the technology business, like platform shifts, what's going on right now with AI, right? So you're just able to take more risk, be more agile. So anyway, that's a long answer, but that's sort of where I net out.
Thanks so much, Sanjeev.
Well, look, it's like this. A founder doesn't have to look over his shoulder as much as a professional manager needs to. Okay, it's as simple as that. He believes there's this, I won't call it divine right, but there is a certain right of being a founder that, मैं कर दूंगा ये. I can take this decision, it's my call. Right? That may or may not rest so easily on the shoulders of a professional manager who has come in laterally from outside or even grown from within, where he'll therefore tend to be less quick in taking decisions. That may also be good, by the way. Founders can take some bad decisions, right? But yeah, a founder will generally decide faster, right or wrong.
No, I think that's absolutely right. In fact, as lawyers, when we are working on deals, and sometimes we actually do say this, that the negotiations that we end up doing with our own clients when we are representing a large conglomerate is much larger than the negotiation that we have to do with the counterparty for them. In fact, we even start singing that nursery rhyme, wheels on the bus go round and round. So that's how some of the decision making happens at times. But anyway, thank you for those perspectives. Mr. Murthy, would you like to add to this?
I agree that having a good, strong, promoter-driven kind of an approach does bring a lot of value to the corporate sector, and decisions get taken faster. The kind of risk appetite that you display is of a completely different nature. But I also thought that the two companies that Rajan referred to, the Indian ones, the biggest Indian ones, they are a study of in contrasts, So one is doing so well with a very active promoter participation, but the other one is doing no less. You see, the key is that at a certain takeoff stage, if the promoters invest in creating systems and processes and a framework which ensures that there are no agency costs between the promoter and the management, and the values of the promoter and his ability to take a risk, his strategic vision is being mirrored by the management, then I think there's no parallel to that as well. I'm personally of the view that at some stage, every promoter driven company, if it wants to scale further up and move on to the next level of orbit, probably has to move on to a stage wherein they move to a more professionally run kind of a system, put in place systems and procedures and frameworks which ensure that not just the company takes off to the next stage, but stuff like family succession also goes on in a seamless manner. For that, you have to create the necessary framework and the governance structures inside the company for it to scale up to the next level. And not every company may be fortunate enough to be completely owner-driven and yet get fantastic results without any failures on the way in the long run. At some stage, I'm of the belief that you cross a certain Rubicon or a threshold, it's better to invest in a professionally run company.
Thank you, thank you. So I think on that, I want to ask Shweta this question, because Shweta, when we were discussing, you had actually mentioned that even in a promoter-owned entity where there is the vision of the promoter, it's important to have that independence.
Yes.
With the
Yes.
professional management team. Can you elaborate on that?
So I think the gentlemen here have definitely said that having the right framework, systems, processes in place, all of that drives the independence of management and the promoters, which I think is key to having good corporate governance. The ability of the management to present their unbiased views, opinions on any aspect, whether it is operations or accounting or whatever, so be it. I think that drives good corporate governance, and then everything else falls into place. So, for example, just to give you another example on Wipro Enterprises, which is the unlisted part of the Wipro group, though we are not listed, we have all the committees and governance processes that are followed in any other listed company, whether be it an audit committee, CSR committee, of which promoters are not part of it. We know the initiatives and the what matters to the promoters, and then yes, we take decision on CSR, but some of those committees, management compensation committees, not required by law, considering an unlisted entity, but all of those governances are being followed. So that drives the longevity of the group, as well as which is the good corporate governance, which drives the longevity of the group as such. And succession planning, all of that then naturally comes as a flow. It does not have to be, it does not have to be, nobody will, make it like, oh, it's an agenda. It will automatically flow.
Yeah, I think, but Sanjeev had made this point, for the professional manager, the burden is a little bit higher, and it's a little more difficult. So how do you think that, it's of course conceptually this independence of the management and the teams is really good, but in reality, do you see it always work?
Yes, I think along with independence of management and promoters comes responsibility and accountability, which I think when both of them go hand in hand, that's when the vision of the promoters is fulfilled, I would say, by the management, who work to some extent on behalf of the promoters to fulfill the agenda they have, the vision they have on whether it is growth targets, profitability, even in terms of the responsibility that management has to have an unbiased opinion on agendas and like ESG, technology, having the right systems in place, whether it is technology or at the plant level or factory level. So that, I think, responsibility is core to what the management has.
Thank you, Shweta.
Thanks.
So, Sanjeev, question for you. We've talked about vision of the promoter, and where you guys invest. It's sometimes the vision of the founder. And how do you sort of balance that at times if it's so say when I'm talking about when there is actually some disagreement with the vision of the founder, how do you find those balances?
So, I stepped aside as CEO of InfoEdge in 2010, and I began to focus full time on investments. And for 2 years, I was lost because, I said, what the hell just happened? I was the CEO of a company where when I spoke and I asked, things got done, and people listened to me. And suddenly, within 3 months, nobody's listening to me. And for me, it was a huge, self-esteem, identity. Boss, ye kya ho gaya? What has happened? But it took me and now the truth is, founders don't listen. So you may have invested in a company, but that doesn't mean the guy will do what you say, because nobody becomes an entrepreneur because he's looking for a new boss, right? He becomes an entrepreneur, he wants to be independent. So he'll be nice to you, polite to you, you've given the money, but ultimately he will do only 2 out of 10 things that you say. So it took me roughly 2 years to adjust to this new reality, that it's okay if people don't listen to me. I have to nudge and influence, I cannot command and control. Right? It doesn't mean people won't necessarily listen to me. Now, if you get used to that, right, and then you learn to live with that and work within that, you find that you're okay. Now, as your portfolio grows larger, when there were only 2-3 companies in the portfolio, I would spend all my time on 3 companies. So there was too much time per company. Okay, so I would get in their way. But as the portfolio grew larger, now we have 100 companies, I don't have that much time for each company. So it's okay, I can suggest and walk away, right? And then they do what they want, and sometimes they don't do what I want them to do, and it's okay. But ultimately, the whole company will run on the founder's vision, not on the investor's vision. Let's be clear about that. The founders are the entrepreneurs. We are not entrepreneurs when we invest.
Thank you, thank you. Rajan, India has a new generation of owners and founders in the startup community. And obviously, there the drive for profitability is really, really high. But at the same time, keeping this whole new corporate governance era that, even when you're not listed, but the ultimate goal is, say, a listing at some point in time. So as an investor, how do you try to, whether you do, balance this whole drive for profitability with, certain other things which may be value creation for the future, but which may impact valuation. So the difference between that value creation and valuation, how as investors, do you play that role?
Yeah, I think, look, it's important to keep in mind what has happened to our startup ecosystem, right? So if you go back to 2000 and after the first Indian unicorn, billion-dollar privately valued company was 2011, and today we have over 100 of them, right? And even at 2015, there were 4 or 5. So really, this is a 6-7 year phenomenon where we've gone from having virtually no ecosystem. Obviously, Sanjeev started his company long before that, but where it's really now become a very large, vibrant ecosystem, a lot of capital, a lot of companies starting up. And I think it just grew very fast. And through the course of that, I think we had, call it 4, 5, 6 errant situations, unfortunately, right? Which showed what could happen if you grow too fast and also you don't have the right control systems in place. And all of them were evil, meaning, I say evil meaning they committed fraud. Okay, so I think where we are today is to say, look, I think as investors, I can speak for the entire, hopefully most of venture capital investors. We are very clear that you can't to build world-class companies, you need world-class governance, right? So without world-class governance, you may have some revenue or some profit, but it won't matter because, if you're doing something wrong, today, if we see something that is not correct, that will get investigated by a board. I think all of us have examples of those, and we will take action, okay? So I think now we're at a very different stage, which is why you're seeing more things coming out into the public. There's obviously news cycles that come and go. As Mr. Murthy said, right, of course, when the first or second happens, it's okay, but 4 or 5, lots of people start getting concerned. But I think we're going through this maturity cycle. I think the one last thing that's left is, of course, we need to keep increasing the Look, so for instance, just to give you a sense, IVCA, which is the Indian Venture Capital Association, for the very first time, it's the only time it's happened in the world is in India, we published a corporate governance playbook for startups, right? Says, depending on every stage, if you're a seed stage company, Series A funded, growth stage company, pre-IPO company, what are those set of governance processes you need to have in place? Now, of course, if you're a very early stage company, you put in place all these things, you know, you may not even like be able to build the company, right? But as things go on, like having an independent CFO, what's the right time to do that, so on and so forth, right? Audit committee and whatnot. So I think those things are falling in place. So what I can say today is, like I can tell you every month, we pass on investing in a new company that we really like because they just don't pass diligence, right? So we would always do diligence. In fact, this week, I spent half a day personally doing diligence on a founder because I thought there was something not quite right, right? So I think the heightened level of, because nobody wants to be, you know, in these situations, right? So I think that is coming along. I'd say the last thing, since we have everything that we say, by the way, I'm assuming is attorney-client privilege, Ajay. I mean, although Ajay pointed out last night saying you can't have like all lawyers and have, I don't even know what that means, but I thought that protected me.
Well, they said it's being recorded.
Okay, good.
It's being recorded.
So yeah, please don't share this with anybody other than your best friends at your firm. Anyway, so I think that the help that we need, I think from all of you and from the government is these, you know, the evil few, handful, need to go to jail, okay? The reality is in the US today, there is a real fear of doing the wrong thing because you go to jail. Unfortunately, in India, we've had situations where you do the wrong thing and then you have a bestseller. You know what I mean? Like only in India, you know? Like that's not cool. So I think we need to collectively just get better at just you know, like finishing it off. Now I realize all of you know, many people have pointed out that in India everything happens. I know, but it needs to happen in my lifetime, no? Because like you know, and this lifetime, not the next one. So I think that's the long answer to your question. But I think, look, the ecosystem has matured. It grew very, very fast. Are there things that collectively we should have all done? Absolutely, we should have done. But what I can tell you right now is the level of intensity is very, very high, right? And it'll go. So it's no longer about is it growth or governance. I mean, we're very clear. Corporate governance failure, it's over.
Yeah, some great points made here. And I think even as lawyers, one of the things that we are very conscious about is we draft agreements and we try to cover every scenario. But it's always very hard to deal with the scenario where the counterparty decides to act in bad faith. You know, no matter how well or how tightly you've drafted your contracts, if there is an intent to act evil, as you said, then there's little that one can do.
Look, fraudsters must go to jail. Okay, like it's like, I don't really understand why a fraudster.
Mr. Murthy likes that statement.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, I know. So I'm going to ask you, India has over the past few years, despite, post-Satyam, corporate law was rewritten. Even after that, in that regime, India has witnessed a fair number of corporate frauds. And while some clearly have identifiable promoters, we've also seen where there has been no identifiable promoter. In fact, some PSUs and all have been the majority shareholders. So, Mr. Murthy, do you think there is a higher risk of fraud in entities that have concentrated ownership versus where the shareholding is, say, dispersed?
Just a short question to Rajan. So when you felt that something is not right about the promoter, did you still make an exception? Or
No exceptions.
No exceptions. Good. So I am of the view that acutely concentrated ownership, there is a preponderance of probability, number one. Number two, even though the law has been changed post-Satyam and then it was completely rewritten, and most of the best practices followed across the world are today reflected in the framework under the Companies Act, as well as the framework which is administered by SEBI. But something which cannot be controlled by law is the human, greed and avarice. So as long as these kind of values don't get superseded by, what my friend Sanjeev said about becoming a custodian right from day one. As long as it's your money, you're free to do whatever you feel like with it. You want to bust your company, go ahead and bust it. But the minute you start getting other investors in, you start getting other stakeholders or shareholders, you have to move to a model of custodianship. You are a trustee, and if you don't do it, then these frauds will continue like this. And I am personally of the view that with this explosion in the startup ecosystem which has happened, rightly so, and the kind of valuations we are getting to see these days, we should also probably have more large investors, especially VC funds or more angel investors, reading the Riot Act to promoters as early as possible.
Thank you. I think during our discussions, Mr. Murthy, you had also mentioned, that promoters who actually are sitting on significant wealth, and I'm not saying ownership right now, I'm actually talking about wealth, they owe some responsibility, some extra responsibility. It doesn't have to be prescribed by law or anything. So, we talked about whether CSR is enough. Do you want to just share a few snippets on that?
You see, the fundamental principle in life is that all of us, whether it is you sitting there or I sitting here, we all have an obligation to carry forward the less fortunate amongst us in society, whatever distance we can ahead. So this is a fundamental obligation that all of us need to subscribe to, that we have an obligation. It would have been the easiest thing for the government to put a tax instead of having a CSR provision. We were the first ones who brought it under statute anywhere in the world. Nowhere in the world was it a provision in a corporate law till we brought it in. You see, the reason was that the best practices or the managerial and the technical abilities which one would find in the corporate sector, they would have to be leveraged to bring about a fundamental change in those parts of our society where they are needed the most. So that is the principle behind which this CSR thing was brought about. And in the initial years, it was a completely, more of a chaperoning kind of a framework. It has become more stringent as time has gone on because the kind of deviations which we found and the manner in which CSR was getting implemented by various corporates left a lot to be desired. So we all have an obligation. It needs to be done. Private sector is very well equipped. When I say private, other than the government sector, it is very well equipped to carry forward its managerial and technical talents for the upliftment of those sections of the society where it is desperately needed. But again, basic principles, first principles should not be lost sight of.
Thank you. I think we are running short of time, so I'll just ask very quick 30-second inputs on how do we create win-win-win situation, and the third win is win for lawyers also, so that we are not out of the ecosystem. Rajan.
Yeah, look, I think, we are well on our way, right? I think we should focus on building awareness, at least speaking for the startup ecosystem. I think that journey has started. And keep in mind that at the end of the day, it's what mankind has struggled with for thousands of years. Evil is evil, So you got to catch the evil, and that's hard. But look, I think we're well on our way. I think collectively as an ecosystem, founders, investors, board members, legal firms, the Indian government, the judicial system, I think we should aim to, really build world-class corporate governance. Today, if you ask me, who's got world-class corporate governance? It's America. But America still has disasters, right? So it doesn't matter how good you get, you're still going to have those occasional, unfortunate events that happen. But I do think we should, as we sort of look at the next 10, 15, 20 years in India, we should aim, much like we have, actually, I would say today in many regulatory areas, India is the best in the world, right? So I think now on corporate governance, we just set that mandate to say, as corporate India, all of it, let's 10, 15, 20 years from now, we say we are going to be the best in the world, right? And I think that's a collective mission. And I think, at least speaking for the ecosystem, it's something that we're on, because we realize that without that, you just don't have world-class companies, right?
Sanjeev, one concluding remark.
Well, I think there has to be substantial effort made by founders, by boards, by investors, possibly by lawyers, in educating managements and founders on the nuances. See, corporate governance is a very nuanced thing. It's not, be honest, no. It's, it's about very small things. So, which I give you 100 examples, which would be in a gray zone. What do you do now? Okay? So there's been substantial effort in educating managements and companies and boards on what's good governance, what's not so good governance, and what's bad governance. And if that effort goes in the next couple of years, 2-3 years, I think you'll see changes happening.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to all my panelists, and thank you for being a wonderful and patient audience.
South Asia Committee of the International Law Section presents the Global Lawyers Summit in association with CNBC TV 18.